The summer before college was supposed to be a time of excitement, a last hurrah before the responsibilities of adulthood took over. Mia and I had been planning this trip for months, dreaming of a weekend getaway to a remote cabin in the Sierra Nevada mountains. It was our final adventure before we went our separate ways, Mia to culinary school in San Francisco and me to university on the East Coast. We wanted a break from the pressures of school, a chance to reconnect and enjoy the serenity of nature. The cabin we rented was nestled deep in the woods, far from civilization. It was an old, weathered structure built in the late 1800s by a prospector named Henry Caldwell. Caldwell had been a solitary figure, obsessed with finding gold and driven mad by his failures. The cabin had passed through many hands since then, but its dark history was never far from the surface. We arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the forest floor. The air was crisp and cool, filled with the scent of pine and earth. The cabin was as charming as we'd hoped, rustic, with a stone fireplace and wooden beams that spoke of a bygone era. After unpacking, we cooked a simple dinner over the fire, roasting marshmallows and laughing as we reminisced about our childhood adventures. The crackling of the fire and the chirping of crickets created a soothing soundtrack, lulling us into a sense of security. But as night fell, subtle signs began to surface. The fire burned lower than expected, no matter how much wood we added. Shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and shift on their own. The wind outside howled mournfully through the trees, sending shivers down my spine. I found it hard to sleep that night. The bed creaked with every movement, and a faint scratching sound came from outside the cabin. I tried to dismiss it as the wind or an animal, but the scratching grew louder and more insistent. It was as if something, or someone, was trying to get in. The cabin had a dark history, steeped in local legends. Henry Caldwell, the original builder, had become increasingly paranoid and reclusive after years of failing to find gold. His journals spoke of eerie noises, shadows that moved on their own, and a feeling of being watched. He vanished one winter without a trace, leaving the cabin abandoned and untouched. Over the years, the cabin changed hands several times. Some owners claimed it was haunted or cursed, but others dismissed these stories as superstition. Despite its rustic charm, no one stayed long. When the cabin was renovated in the 1980s and turned into a rental, the tales of Henry Caldwell and his descent into madness seemed like distant memories, until we arrived. The second night started off normally. We had a quiet dinner and spent the evening sitting by the fire, talking about our plans for the future. As we prepared for bed, the scratching sound returned, accompanied by a faint, unsettling growl. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just an animal. Mia, however, was already asleep, her deep breaths a testament to her exhaustion. I lay awake, my mind racing with thoughts of the cabin's dark past and the strange noises outside. In the dead of night, the scratching grew louder, now accompanied by a series of low, guttural growls that seemed to come from just beyond the window. My heart pounded in my chest as I got up and peeked outside. The darkness was absolute, and I saw nothing but the shifting shadows of the trees. The next morning, we decided to explore the area around the cabin, hoping to distract ourselves from the unsettling events of the previous night. The forest was beautiful in the daylight, with sunlight filtering through the trees and a gentle breeze rustling the leaves. We followed a deer trail and discovered a small, abandoned cabin nearby. It was in worse shape than the one we were staying in, its roof sagging and its windows broken. As we approached, I felt a sense of unease, but I shrugged it off as nerves. That evening, as the sun set and the forest grew dark, we returned to the main cabin. The scratching sound resumed, louder and more insistent. We tried to ignore it, but as the night wore on, the growls became more pronounced, a constant presence that gnawed at our nerves. Around midnight, the growling turned into a deafening roar. The windows rattled, and the door creaked ominously. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door, but there was nothing to see, just the dark, silent forest. I closed the door and locked it, my hands shaking. We went back to bed, but sleep was elusive. The scratching continued, now joined by a series of heavy thuds against the walls. It felt like something, or someone, was trying to break in. By the third night, we were exhausted and on edge. The noises had become unbearable, a constant, terrifying presence. We were convinced something was out there, trying to get in. That night, the scratching turned into banging, as if someone, or something, was pounding on the walls. The growls were louder, more aggressive. I could hear footsteps outside, heavy and deliberate, moving around the cabin. Unable to take it anymore, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a metal rod from the fireplace and cautiously opened the door. The night was cold and silent, the forest eerily still. As I stepped outside, I heard a low growl behind me. I turned around, but there was nothing there, only darkness. I crept around the cabin, the flashlight beam cutting through the night. Suddenly, I saw it, a figure, moving swiftly and silently through the trees. My heart raced as I approached the figure, gripping the rod tightly. The figure was tall and shadowy, its features obscured by the darkness. I called out, but it didn't respond. It just continued to move, its growls growing louder. I was close enough now to see its face, a twisted, nightmarish visage with hollow eyes and a gaping mouth. The figure lunged at me, its movements inhumanly fast. I swung the rod, but it dodged with ease. The rod hit the wall, sending a shock of pain through my arms. The figure grabbed my wrist, its grip like iron. I screamed, but it didn't let go. Mia came running, trying to help, but the figure was too strong. In a desperate move, I struck at its face, causing it to recoil. "Run, Mia!" I shouted, using the brief reprieve to push the figure away. We stumbled back into the cabin, the figure growling and clawing at the door. The sound of its rage was deafening, a constant, terrifying presence. We knew we had to leave. The figure was relentless, its growls echoing through the night. We grabbed our things and fled into the darkness, our footsteps pounding the ground as we ran. The figure pursued us, its growls growing louder and more frantic. We ran through the forest, the trees blurring past us. Mia stumbled beside me, her breath ragged. I pulled her along, pushing through the pain and exhaustion. We had to get to the road, we had to get away. The forest seemed endless, the darkness oppressive. We could hear the figure's footsteps behind us, growing ever closer. I glanced back and saw its shadowy form moving swiftly through the trees, its eyes glowing with a sinister light. Finally, we reached the road. I could see headlights approaching, and I waved frantically. A car screeched to a halt, the driver honking the horn. We ran to the car, throwing ourselves into the back seat. The driver, a man with a pale face, looked at us in shock. "Get in," he shouted, his voice filled with urgency. We scrambled into the car, the figure slamming into the vehicle as the man floored the gas pedal. The car lurched forward, leaving the figure behind in a cloud of dust. We sped away, our hearts pounding, our bodies shaking with fear. As we drove away, I looked back at the cabin and the figure standing in the road. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, watching us as we fled. The man driving the car glanced at us in the rearview mirror, his face a mix of concern and disbelief. "Are you two okay?" he asked. I nodded, unable to speak. Mia clung to me, her body trembling as she buried her face in my shoulder. We were safe, for now. But I knew that whatever had attacked us was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next chance. The man took us to the nearest town, where we were able to contact the authorities. We reported the incident, but when they went to investigate, the cabin was empty. The figure had vanished, and there was no sign of the violence we had described. The police were skeptical, attributing the incident to an animal attack or a prank. But Mia and I knew the truth. We had faced something far more sinister, something that defied explanation. As we left the town and headed to our respective homes, I couldn't shake the feeling that the nightmare was far from over. The figure's eyes, its growls, and the terror it instilled would haunt me forever. Mia and I eventually went our separate ways, but the memories of that summer remained with us. We rarely spoke about the incident, each of us trying to move on from the horrors we had faced. But deep down, we knew that the cabin and the figure would always be a part of our lives, a dark reminder of the terror that lurked in the shadows. As the years went by, we tried to forget the cabin, the figure, and the fear. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I would hear a faint scratching at the window, or a low growl in the darkness. And I would remember that summer, the cabin, and the figure that had tried to take everything from us. And I would wonder if, somewhere out there in the forest, it was still waiting, waiting for its next victims, waiting for its next chance to strike. James and I had been eagerly anticipating our vacation to the secluded cabin in Kentucky. The months leading up to this getaway were filled with meticulous planning and excitement. We had both been craving a break from our hectic schedules and needed some time away from the relentless pace of our everyday lives. The drive to our destination was a welcome escape. The route took us through winding roads and dense forests, with each turn revealing more of the picturesque landscape. The late afternoon sun cast a warm, golden light over the rolling hills and dense woods. The colors of the leaves, ranging from deep greens to vibrant oranges, created a soothing tapestry of nature. The air was crisp and fresh, a stark contrast to the city's smog and noise. As we approached the cabin, nestled deep within the forest, a sense of calm washed over us. The rustic charm of the wooden structure, combined with the surrounding beauty of the untouched forest, felt like a perfect retreat from the world. After we arrived, we quickly set about unloading our bags. The cabin, with its wooden beams and stone fireplace, exuded a cozy and inviting atmosphere. We took a deep breath of the pine-scented air, savoring the tranquility that enveloped us. Our evening was spent preparing a simple yet satisfying dinner over an open flame. The grilling process, combined with the gentle crackle of the fire, was therapeutic. As night fell, we retired to the living room. The warmth of the fire and the soft glow of the cabin's interior created an intimate and serene environment. We settled on the plush sofas, sharing stories and laughter. The crackling of the logs and the occasional sound of the wind rustling through the trees outside provided a comforting backdrop to our evening. The world outside seemed to disappear, leaving us cocooned in our own little paradise. The peace of our escape was abruptly disrupted on the fourth night when a knock at the door startled us. James and I exchanged uneasy glances. The tranquil atmosphere was suddenly pierced by the intrusion of an unexpected guest. James went to answer the door, and I watched through the small window beside it as a man appeared on the porch. The man, introducing himself as Hank, appeared to be a local resident. He was tall with a weather-beaten face partially hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. His plaid shirt and rugged appearance suggested a familiarity with the land. Although his initial greeting was polite, there was an unsettling undertone to his demeanor. He spoke casually about the local area, mentioning wild animals, unpredictable weather, and other hazards with a tone that seemed more cautionary than reassuring. As Hank continued to talk, I noticed his casual grip on a shotgun slung over his shoulder. His manner was unsettling, his seemingly friendly warnings carried a subtle hint of menace. After a brief and awkward conversation, Hank left. As we closed the door, a palpable sense of unease settled over us. The cabin, which had once felt like a peaceful retreat, now seemed less secure. The ominous undercurrent of Hank's visit left us feeling vulnerable. That night, the cabin seemed different. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle outside, seemed amplified. The shadows cast by the trees seemed darker, and the forest that had once appeared serene now felt like a labyrinth of hidden dangers. The sense of being watched grew stronger, making it difficult to shake the feeling that we were no longer alone in our secluded paradise. In the days following Hank's visit, our sense of unease continued to build. The once charming forest around us now felt claustrophobic and menacing. During the day, we occasionally heard rustling noises outside the cabin, but each time we investigated, we found nothing out of the ordinary. The sound seemed to come from every direction, creating a disorienting effect. Nights were particularly unsettling. The creaking of the cabin's wooden structure, once a comforting reminder of its rustic charm, now seemed to echo with an ominous resonance. The darkness outside felt more oppressive, and every shadow seemed to conceal something sinister. On the fifth night, as we prepared dinner, a loud crash shattered the relative silence. The noise came from outside the cabin, causing our hearts to race. We grabbed a flashlight and stepped out into the cool night air. The forest, bathed in moonlight, cast eerie, shifting shadows that danced across the ground. We conducted a thorough search of the area, our flashlight beams cutting through the darkness, but found no immediate cause for the disturbance. The silence that followed the crash was unsettling. It was as though the forest had swallowed the sound, leaving an oppressive quiet in its wake. We returned to the cabin, but the sense of unease lingered. The once comforting surroundings now felt charged with an undercurrent of fear, and the peaceful retreat we had envisioned seemed increasingly distant. The sixth night was when our growing fears were realized. We had just finished dinner and were relaxing in the living room when a sudden, violent crash jolted us. The noise came from the door, and we turned to see that the lock had been smashed. The door hung open, its frame splintered and damaged. The sight of the broken door sent a surge of adrenaline through me, and my heart pounded with a mix of fear and urgency. Hank stood in the doorway, his presence more menacing than ever. His weather-beaten face, partially obscured by the brim of his hat, was twisted into a sinister grin. He carried a shotgun with a casual ease that belied its danger. The cabin, which had once been our sanctuary, now felt like a trap. James's protective instincts kicked in immediately. "Hank, you need to leave," he said, trying to sound calm despite the fear evident in his voice. Hank's grin widened as he raised the shotgun, the metallic click of the safety being removed echoing ominously in the quiet cabin. Without warning, Hank fired the shotgun. The deafening blast shattered the stillness and struck me in the side. The pain was immediate and intense, sending me collapsing onto the floor. Blood began to seep through my clothes, and the room spun violently. I tried to stay conscious, but the pain was overwhelming, and my vision started to blur. The noise of the gunfire and the chaos of the cabin felt surreal, like I was trapped in a nightmarish vision. The cabin quickly devolved into chaos as James and Hank engaged in a desperate struggle. Furniture was overturned, and belongings were strewn across the floor in a chaotic mess. James fought fiercely, using both of our Glocks to defend us. The confined space of the cabin made the fight feel even more intense, with every movement and sound magnified by the small, enclosed area. I lay on the floor, the pain from my wound sharp and relentless. Despite my condition, I managed to reload one of the Glocks. My hands were shaky and unsteady, but I was determined to help James. Each shot I fired was a desperate attempt to fend off Hank and provide support to James. The dim lighting of the cabin created eerie shadows, making it difficult to see clearly and adding to the disorienting atmosphere. My strength began to wane as the fight continued. The pain and exhaustion were overwhelming, and my efforts to stay conscious became increasingly futile. Despite my best efforts, I eventually succumbed to the darkness, slipping into unconsciousness. My last coherent thought was a desperate hope that James would be able to find a way out of this nightmarish situation. When I came to, the cabin was eerily quiet. The familiar surroundings now felt alien and unsettling. James lay unconscious on the floor, and my own wound, while it had started to clot, was still painful and raw. I knew I had to act quickly, but every movement was a struggle. Summoning all my remaining strength, I managed to get up. My vision swam as I dragged myself toward James. With considerable effort, I managed to loop his arm around my shoulders, trying to support him as best as I could. The dense woods outside the cabin felt almost hostile as I made my way through the underbrush. The thick foliage and uneven terrain made each step a battle against both physical pain and mental exhaustion. The forest was thick and overgrown, and every movement was a struggle. I had to stop frequently to rest, the effort of moving James through the dense woods taking its toll on me. My breathing grew ragged, and the pain from my wound intensified with each step. Despite my efforts, progress was painfully slow, and I could feel my strength slipping away. After what felt like an eternity, I finally emerged onto the road. Exhausted and barely conscious, I collapsed onto the pavement. My strength was nearly gone, and I struggled to hold my phone. I fumbled with the buttons, managing to dial 911 with a shaky hand. My voice was weak and barely audible as I tried to explain our situation to the dispatcher. The pain and exhaustion were overwhelming, and I felt my consciousness slipping away. As I lay on the road, barely conscious, the distant sound of approaching vehicles grew louder. The headlights of an oncoming car cut through the darkness. A middle-aged couple in a pickup truck stopped when they saw me. The woman's face was etched with concern as she quickly assessed the situation. She knelt beside me, gently shaking my shoulders in a desperate attempt to wake me. "Can you hear me? Please, stay with me," she urged, her voice filled with urgency. Despite her efforts, I remained unresponsive, my eyes closed and my breathing shallow. The man, seeing the gravity of the situation, moved quickly to check on James, who was still lying in the forest. With a mix of strength and care, he carried James to the road. The woman took over the 911 call, her voice steady as she provided the dispatcher with our location and details. The sound of sirens grew louder as the emergency vehicles arrived, their flashing lights slicing through the darkness. The paramedics worked with practiced efficiency, attending to both James and me with skill and urgency. The couple's timely intervention was crucial. As the paramedics stabilized us and prepared us for transport, I felt a glimmer of hope amidst the chaos. The ordeal had been harrowing, but with the arrival of professional help, we were finally on the path to recovery. Lucas and I were yearning for a break from our busy lives when we decided on a vacation. After extensive research and numerous reviews, we found the perfect spot, San Rafael, a quaint village nestled in the Sierra Madre Mountains of Mexico. Known for its breathtaking scenery and serene atmosphere, it seemed like the ideal place for us to unwind and reconnect. The journey to San Rafael was nothing short of magical. As we drove along the winding roads, the scenery transformed from bustling cityscapes to lush, green forests and rolling hills. The village appeared like something out of a postcard, its adobe houses adorned with vibrant colors, and the air filled with the tantalizing aroma of local cuisine. Our rental was a charming adobe house on the outskirts, complete with a thatched roof and a lovely courtyard overflowing with blooming flowers. The traditional architecture and peaceful surroundings made it clear we had chosen the perfect retreat. For the first few days, everything went perfectly. We explored the local markets, sampled fresh produce, and enjoyed the local cuisine. The evenings were spent immersed in the lively culture of the village, mingling with the friendly locals and enjoying traditional music and dance. It was a blissful escape from our everyday lives, a peaceful respite we had been craving. One evening, as we wandered through the village square, we were approached by a group of locals. They invited us to a festival celebrating the village's rich heritage. The festival was a vibrant spectacle, filled with traditional music, dance, and food. Among the crowd was a man named Carlos, who introduced himself as a local guide. His offer to show us some of the area's hidden gems seemed generous, but his intense gaze and the urgency in his voice left me feeling uneasy. Despite my reservations, Lucas was eager for adventure. We arranged to meet Carlos the following morning, hoping his local knowledge would enhance our experience. The festival continued to be a whirlwind of activity, with colorful lights and the sounds of music and laughter filling the night. Although I enjoyed the festivities, Carlos's behavior lingered in my mind. There was something about his intense demeanor that didn't sit right with me. The next morning, Carlos arrived at our rental house with a rugged backpack and a wide smile. We set out on a path that led deeper into the mountains, the scenery becoming more rugged and remote as we went. Carlos's knowledge of the area was impressive, and he shared fascinating stories about the region's history. However, his increasing urgency and the way he frequently scanned our surroundings made me increasingly uncomfortable. After several hours of hiking, we arrived at a secluded site with an old, dilapidated building that Carlos claimed was a historical landmark. The building, partially covered in vines and in a state of disrepair, seemed like a relic of the past. As we prepared to explore, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. A group of men emerged from the shadows, their faces obscured by dark clothing and their demeanor threatening. Carlos's friendly facade disappeared instantly. He stepped aside, revealing his true nature as he exchanged tense words with the leader of the group, a burly man with a prominent scar. The men surrounded us, their hostility palpable. Panic surged through me as I realized that our idyllic retreat had turned into a dangerous confrontation. The men, armed with rifles and wearing menacing expressions, demanded our valuables and electronic devices. Lucas and I, our hearts racing, complied, handing over our belongings. The leader's frustration grew as he rifled through our bags, tossing items aside with increasing aggression. I glanced at Lucas, whose face was a mix of fear and determination. We had brought a Ruger P-89 for protection, and as the situation worsened, I knew we had to act. My hands were shaking as I reached for the Ruger, trying to steady myself. The weight of the gun in my hand felt both reassuring and daunting. "Drop it," the leader barked, his voice harsh and commanding. I hesitated, but the urgency in Lucas's voice spurred me into action. "Run," he shouted. I aimed the Ruger at the leader and fired a shot, the sound of the gunshot echoing through the forest. The leader ducked, and the men around us became frantic, their movements chaotic. The leader retaliated with his own weapon, and I felt a sharp, searing pain in my side as he fired. I collapsed to the ground, my vision blurring, my side throbbing with intense pain. Lucas, dazed and struggling, tried to get up but was quickly overwhelmed by one of the men. The violence around us was relentless and brutal, each man attacking with calculated fury. The struggle was fierce. I managed to crawl towards Lucas, but my injury made every movement excruciating. I reached for the Ruger, but my hands were unsteady. I fired another shot, but the leader had taken cover, and the chaos around us continued to escalate. The men searched through our belongings more aggressively, their frustration evident. In a final, desperate attempt, I dragged myself closer to Lucas, looping his arm around my shoulders. Despite the intense pain and exhaustion, I managed to pull him through the dense forest. The underbrush was thick and difficult to navigate, making each step a battle. My side was throbbing, but I focused on getting us to safety. The forest seemed endless, the shadows growing darker as night fell. My strength was nearly depleted, and Lucas's weight felt like an anchor. Each step was a struggle, and the dense vegetation made our progress slow and difficult. My side, though clotting somewhat, still hurt with every movement, and the fear of being recaptured spurred me on. As we stumbled through the forest, the sounds of distant shouts and crackling branches heightened my sense of danger. I tried to stay focused, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. The forest felt like it was closing in on us, the darkness making it hard to see where we were going. Finally, we reached a dirt road. Exhausted and barely able to move, I collapsed at the roadside. My hands trembled as I fumbled with my phone, trying to dial 911. My vision was failing, and my voice was barely more than a whisper. I tried to explain our situation to the dispatcher, but the connection was weak and unreliable. As I lay on the road, I heard the distant sound of a car approaching. My hope was fleeting, but my strength was almost gone. The vehicle stopped, and a woman got out, her face showing concern as she saw me lying there. She rushed to my side, shaking me gently in a desperate attempt to wake me. But my strength was spent, and I lost consciousness. The woman, realizing the gravity of our situation, immediately called for emergency assistance. Her husband helped her get Lucas and me into their car. The drive to the nearest town was agonizing, with every bump in the road sending jolts of pain through my body. The sense of urgency was palpable as we sped towards help. Upon arriving at the hospital, medical staff took over with remarkable efficiency. They quickly assessed our injuries, providing immediate care to stabilize both Lucas and me. Their swift actions were a beacon of hope amidst the chaos. I could barely register their efforts before slipping back into unconsciousness. 3 days later, I woke up in a hospital bed. The sterile environment was a far cry from the rugged mountains of San Rafael. My parents were by my side, their faces reflecting a mix of worry and relief. The severity of our ordeal slowly sank in as I took in my surroundings. The doctors explained that my wound had started to clot, which had prevented further bleeding. However, I would need time to fully recover. Lucas was stable but still in a fragile state. The ordeal had left its mark on both of us, but we were grateful for the unexpected kindness of strangers and the determination that had helped us survive. San Rafael, once a haven of tranquility, had transformed into a haunting memory. The experience had changed our perspective, but we found strength in each other and in the support we received. Despite the trauma, we were determined to move forward and cherish the resilience we had discovered in ourselves and each other. If you enjoyed this video, please support our goal of providing quality horror content for free on YouTube by liking and sharing this video along with subscribing to our YouTube channel. If you have any questions, concerns, comments or story ideas to be narrated on this channel, please contact us at contacthorrorfiles@yahoo.com. Thank you for tuning in today and we hope to see you tomorrow on Horror Files for more horror stories.